So in part 2, a total of 4 parts, this will be the part we're going to finish up with, is structure and function. So what does each part do? We'll kind of go over different nuclei and stuff like that in this, but for the most part, we're going to look at what does this part of the cerebellum do, what does this part of the cerebellum do, what does this part of the cerebrum do, and so on and so forth. So first, we're going to look at the components of the hindbrain and midbrain. And because you memorized embryonic development, you know what parts are the hindbrain and what parts of the midbrain. And then we're going to describe the location and function of the reticular formation. The reticular formation can be really challenging for some students, but it's just a way that the brain kind of fans out the signals. It's a way to talk to different parts of the brain. So embryonic myelencephalon becomes the medulla oblongata. The medulla oblongata, cardiac center, adjusts rate and force for heartbeat. Vasomotor, adjusts blood vessel diameter. Respiratory, control rate and depth of breathing. And reflexes for coughing, sneezing, gagging, swallowing, vomiting, so on and so forth. Another way to think about it, if you know the cranial nerves very well, and your lab teacher is making you memorize cranial nerves, you will see the medulla oblongata has a bunch of cranial nerves that come out just around and above and below it, and to the side of it. All of those are going to be working on muscles of the pharynx and larynx. That's going to be gagging and swallowing. So you can see directly, if you kind of make those connections, that the medulla oblongata obviously is going to be involved in swallowing, coughing, and sneezing and stuff like that. What doesn't make sense is force for the heart. And you're like, okay, heart. All right, breathing. Interesting. If you can find where the vagus nerve comes out, there are some fibers in the vagus nerve that control the rate and force for the heart and breathing. So if you kind of know the cranial nerves, a lot of these brainstem structures, you can kind of understand where, what they're actually going to do. And here are the cranial nerves again, where you can see the diencephalon of the thalamus and the mammillary body, the midbrain right there, the pons, the medulla oblongata is right there. It has different structures, but we're just going to say anything below the pons is the medulla oblongata and eventually the spinal cord. And here you can see glossopharyngeal is throat. Vagus nerve is the one that travels all the way down to your upper part of your intestines. You have your hypoglossal nerve, which is going to be tongue and throat. So if you kind of know where the cranial nerves are on these different types of structures, you can kind of know what they do. So the metencephalon develops in the pons and the cerebellum. The pons is the anterior bulge, and then the cerebellum is what is right behind it. For the pons, it has ascending sensory tracts and descending motor tracts. So there's pathways in and out of the cerebellum also, so it goes backwards. It's got cranial nerves, 5, 6, 7, and 8. It has a reticular formation in the pons, which contains additional nuclei for sleep, respiration, and posture. So if you kind of see the pons, has some roles in hearing, equilibrium, taste, and facial, eye movement, facial expressions via the facial nerve. The mesencephalon will then become the mature brain. So becomes one mature brain structure, the midbrain. So if you kind of go back, the mesencephalon becomes the mesencephalon. The mesencephalon just turns into the midbrain. So this is a very short segment. It connects the hindbrain to the forebrain. At the back end of it is a cerebral aqueduct. It's going to contain continuations of the lateral lemniscus and the reticular formations. I'll kind of show you what they are, but for now, don't memorize the terms. They're just tracks on how to get from point A to point B. And they're going to have the motor nuclei of 2 cranial nerves, eye movement, ocular motor, and trochlear. We look at those when we look at the eye. So right now, You don't care about those cranial nerves. The midbrain is going to have a structure called the substantia nigra. And I mentioned this in an earlier lecture. This is a dark gray to black nuclei pigmented with melanin. The motor center relays inhibitory signals to the thalamus and the basal nuclei, preventing unwanted body movement. If you think about that, unwanted body movement, that's going to be Parkinson's. So degeneration of neurons leads to tremors of Parkinson's disease. So let's take a look at the substantia nigra. If you look at it, it kind of looks like a dark staining area of the brain. So that's what the substantia nigra is, and usually in Parkinson's, this is one of the first areas you start seeing damage. This is the reticular formation, and if you see the reticular formation, you just see a bunch of arrows. So it's a loosely organized web of gray matter that runs vertically through all levels of the brainstem. Clusters of gray matter scatters throughout the pons, midbrain, medulla, occupies space between white matter fiber tracts and brainstem, has connections with many areas of the cerebrum. Pretty much the reticular formation just allows the different areas of the brain to talk to each other. You can have networks for somatic motor control. We're not going to go over those again because we talked about them when we talked about somatic and visceral, and we talked about motor, but maintain tone, balance, posture. You can have cardiovascular control, pain modulation, sleep, consciousness, and the ability for the brain to kind of ignore stuff that's just bothering it or just repetitive stuff. Kind of like when we talked about sense of smell, how it can just ignore that old scent and move on to something new. But reticular formation is that communication within the brain that can allow it to do all these different things. The cerebellum, largest part of the hindbrain, second largest part of the brain as a whole, consists of left and right cerebellar hemispheres. It has gray folds, has deep nuclei in each hemisphere. It's going to have white matter branching pattern that's called the arbor vitae that we talked about. Cerebellum monitors muscle contraction and aids in muscle coordination. It evaluates sensory input coming in, comparing textures without looking at them, spatial perception and comprehension of different views of three-dimensional objects. So if you walk around something, this is all going to be evaluated in the cerebellum, and also timekeeping. So you can predict movements of objects. So if you're sitting there and you're thinking, you're watching something move, you're looking out the window in class, you can predict where that's going to be in the future. If you're watching a cloud just moving past, you can say in about 2 minutes it's going to be in that location. This is all happening in the cerebellum. You can also do hearing. Some pitch and similar sounding words are going to be in the cerebellum. Planning, scheduling tasks. And if you cut or lesion the cerebellum, it may result in equilibrium, motor coordination, emotional overreactions, and trouble with impulse control. Does that sound similar to anything else that you've ever experienced in your life? Problems with equilibrium, motor coordination, emotional overreaction. Yep. Alcohol. So if an alcohol, the OH molecule will start to bind in the cerebellum and start inhibiting some of its functions. So you can lesion it, or you can take a copious amount of alcohol and start becoming belligerent, yelling at people, falling down, and impulse control and other problems. Yep. So okay. So all right, forebrain. What are the different parts of the forebrain, and what are those parts going to do? So we're going to identify the 5 lobes, cerebellum. We're going to look at the 3 major components of the diencephalon. We kind of mentioned that before. What are the 3 types of tracts of cerebral white matter? How does signals get from one side to another? And what are the cell types and arrangement of the cortex? You've all heard of the 5 or 6 layers of the cortex. We're going to talk about a term called the neocortex because those layers are going to be very important later on. And we're going to function the basal nuclei in the limbic system. So the diencephalon has thalamus, hypothalamus, and epithalamus. Epithalamus is 2 structures. Thalamus is a combination of a bunch of nuclei. Hypothalamus has a bunch of different parts of it also. The hypothalamus eventually is going to, but one of its major thing you're going to hear about in AMP2 is going to be part of endocrine, because it has a special path to get either hormones directly via a tube or via blood supply directly to the pituitary gland. So hypothalamus is going to be involved in this. Thalamus is going to be interesting, and then we'll finish up with the epithalamus. So the telencephalon we'll talk about later. Cerebrum. The thalamus. Oval mass, each side of the brain, perched at the superior end of the brainstem beneath the cerebral hemisphere. So the thalamus is all these different types of nuclei. You have some on the medial side, you have some on the front, some on the lateral, some on the ventral, some on the posterior. And in them, in these different groups, you have multiple nuclei. So we're not going to go into all the different nuclei because 23 nuclei, 5 major functional groups, too much to learn. Each one is doing its own thing, and it's crazy for you to memorize those. Gateway to the cerebral cortex. Years ago, not long ago, probably 10 years ago or 12 years ago, they thought that the thalamus was pretty much just a relay station. So all it was that operator sitting there saying, yes, I'm going to patch this through to this part of the cerebrum. I'm going to patch this through to this part of the cerebrum. And it just thought it was a networking system. But I'm going to show you that some of the cells in the nuclei, I told you there's 23-ish nuclei in them. Each one of those nuclei is going to have a cell body. Each one of those cell bodies is going to have different types of receptors on them. Those different types of receptors are going to respond to neurotransmitters differently. So it's not just, I'm going to connect you to the next thing. It does processing in there. It can stop a signal going to the amygdala. It can stop something going to the prefrontal cortex. So there are ways to block memories from being formed. So now there is a drug being marketed that if you have traumatic brain injury, you take this drug, it blocks the receptors inside part of the thalamus, and then you can't create a memory from it. So you don't remember that you had that traumatic event, which means you don't have post-traumatic stress disorder. And if you're like, wow, that sounds really good, think about the person or the group of people or the governmental agency that gave the money to do this test. It was the Defense Department, so they can give this to soldiers so they can go back onto the battlefield without post-traumatic stress disorder. So they found things in the thalamus that they're able to take advantage of. So it's involved in memory, emotional function, the limbic system we're going to talk about because that's going to be the emotional response. The hypothalamus forms part of the walls and floor of the third ventricle. We're really going to be looking at it when we're going to be talking about the pituitary gland, but it also is going to send signals to the limbic system. Oh, the mammillary body contains 3 to 4 nuclei. That's going to relay symbols to the limbic system, to the thalamus, and then back to the limbic system. So all these things are close together, so they all kind of communicate with one another. So the diencephalon, just hypothalamus, you have an infundibulum, which is a little stalk that attaches to the pituitary gland. So I mentioned the pituitary gland and the hypothalamus. That connection is very important. Major control center of the autonomic nervous system and the endocrine system. It's an essential role in homeostatic regulation of body systems. So if things get out of whack, the hypothalamus can talk to the pituitary gland, and it can change blood pressure. It can change pH. It can change all these other things. So controls the anterior pituitary growth, metabolism, reproduction, stress response. And then more, that's the same, but it can do thermoregulation. So if you get too high, it can start to lose heat. If it gets too cold, it can start promoting heat reabsorption when it's too low. Hypothalamus is also involved in food and water intake. If you're hungry, it's your hypothalamus telling you you're hungry. If you need to have more blood glucose, amino acids, those are going to go to different types of villi on your tongue to kind of for the food. So what you're saying is, I want to have amino acids. I want to have meat. I want to have something sweet. I want to have those sugars. It's also going to be involved in thirst center and monitoring the osmolarity of the blood. If the osmolarity of the blood gets too high, you're going to become thirsty because you want to dilute those ions in the blood. It's also involved in the rhythmic of sleep and waking. It's going to control the 24 hours, the circadian rhythm of activity. Also involved in memory, and anything that's really receiving or sending signals to the hypothalamus is now being considered part of memory, because memory consolidation, I shouldn't really say consolidation, but memories that you kind of can think about at this level is going to be in the hypothalamus. Also, emotional behavior, anger, aggression, fear, pleasure, contentment is involved with the hypothalamus, because the hypothalamus is going to be involved in other parts of the brain. There are going to be connections to that are going to be in charge of anger, aggression, and fear. You have the epithalamus, which is just the pineal gland and the habenula, and we're not really going to talk about them, but they're back here. And the reason why we're not talking about them is because we spend a lot of time on the thalamus and the hypothalamus. Thalamus is right there, hypothalamus is right there. That's why all of that is part of the diencephalon. Cerebrum, the largest and most important, I guess, part of the brain. So it's a seat of sensory perception, memory, thought, judgment, voluntary motor actions. If you wanted to run, jump, or scream, it would all be in this part of the brain right there, where you can actually produce those actions. If you wanted to sit and think and make a judgment on, do I want to do this? That's all going to be in the prefrontal cortex. We're going to make those thoughts and kind of judge and plan. All of that is part of the new cortex, where other animals can't do it. You have two hemispheres separated by the longitudinal fissure. They're connected by the corpus callosum, which we saw. They have the gyri and the sulci. You're going to have the 5 lobes. You're going to have the frontal lobe. Frontal lobe, voluntary motor function, because it has the precentral gyri, which is the primary motor cortex. So all of this dark blue is your primary motor cortex. That's part of the frontal lobe. But what you really think about frontal lobe, motivation, foresight, planning, memory, mood, emotion, social judgment, and aggression, all of that's going to be frontal lobe. And they have an example of Phineas Gage. You might have heard that name in high school or middle school. He was a railroad worker that was using a pneumatic press that was shooting down, a hydraulic press that shot down railroad spikes into the ground. He didn't have it set right, so what happened is he had it set on a rock and it was up, so the spike went down, it came back up and shot right through this area of his skull and through his brain. So he went to the hospital, he walked, had a big spike through his brain. The doctor, because it was the end of the 1800s or beginning of 1900s, just pulled it out, stopped the bleeding, and the poor guy lived. And because afterwards, before he used to go to church, he used to be peaceful, people used to like him. Afterwards, he was angry, he was upset. He never used to drink alcohol. He became an alcoholic. So because of people like him, and I told you, like gunshot wounds, stabs, and other things, they start learning what the different parts of the brain are doing. So because of Phineas Gage, they have a lot of stories about what part of the brain was damaged, and they're able to use those types of those records to kind of do animal testing and see if those were backed up. So that's why we know that memory, planning, and other stuff is important and involved in the frontal cortex. Parietal is going to be sensory information, taste, some visual processing, and the primary sensory is going to be right below it in the postcentral sulcus. And all of that was sensory. Occipital lobe, primary visual center of the brain. So this is where you start doing shapes, you start doing shadows, you start doing pictures, and then you start going into the parietal lobe where you start understanding this is somebody's name. When I see this picture, this is this person. And then finally, temporal, hearing, smell, learning, memory, and some aspects of vision and emotion. So when you're studying this, memorize a couple little things about each, and you'll get them right on the test. But I guarantee you, frontal lobe, memory, planning, parietal lobe, obviously sensory, occipital, visual, temporal, hearing, smell, and learning and memory. And the insula is just down there. It's the other part, but spoken language and taste, but it's not in red, so don't memorize it. And here's how it kind of talks to each other. You can see these little tracks and how they project all around in this spiral pattern. So you can kind of see that there's a way the brain is going to kind of look and talk to each other. You have projection tracks that either go vertically between higher and lower brain centers. They carry information from the cerebrum to the rest of the body. Commissures just means it's going back and forth from one side to another. You have association tracks, which these are going to be within the same cerebral hemisphere. And that's kind of what we're going to look at right here. So neural integration is carried out in gray matter of the cerebrum. If you look here, 1 layer, 2 layers, 3, 4, 5, 6. 6-layer cortex. Look at all of those neurons in there. It's receiving information from here and from here. In this 4th layer, it's actually communicating within its own layer. Down here is where all those axons are coming in, where they're starting to go to the cortical surface. So you can see everything we've learned up to this point, just by receiving all these different inputs, can make studying the brain extremely complicated. Even though it's only 1 to 3 millimeters thick, you have so many cells in that area, 14 to 16 billion neurons in the cortex, that all of those things are either going to turn on or turn off. Stellate cells, pyramidal cells, you kind of saw them. I mentioned the neocortex because it's 6-layer instead of 5. 90% of the human cerebral cortex is going to be 6 layers. The basal nuclei, to kind of finish up, massive gray matter, buried deep in the white matter, lateral to the thalamus. It receives input from the substantia nigra that we talked about with Parkinson's of the midbrain, sends signal back to both of these locations, and the basal nuclei is involved in motor control. That's why the basal nuclei and the substantia nigra is the one that's going to be involved in Parkinson's. It's going to talk to these 3 brains, these 3 brain centers, form the basal nuclei, the caudate nucleus, putamen, and the global pallidus. These are going to be ways they talk to other different parts, but we're not going to kind of go into them. Finally, limbic, hippocampus and amygdala. If you remember anything from this lecture, memorize what's the hippocampus and what's the amygdala. The hippocampus is in the medial portion of the temporal lobe. It's memory. The amygdala is just rostral or in front to the hippocampus, and it does emotion. When I learned this, Amy G. Dalla, somebody's name. If you make her mad, she's going to become emotional. Probably not the best mnemonic to use anymore, but amygdala is going to be those emotional outbursts, and because it's tied to the hippocampus, so emotions are always going to be tied to memory. So through the limbic system, components are connected through complex loops of fibers, allowing us somewhat circular patterns of feedback. Limbic system structures have centers in both gratification and aversion. Gratification, pleasure or reward. Aversion, fear or sorrow. So that's why most of your memories are going to be tied to some type of emotion.